Story 1 of 5. FARA by-election, Milthorpe vs. One Nation contest and coalition preference strategy. FARA by-election, Milthorpe vs. One Nation contest and coalition preference strategy. Here's what every outlet agrees on. Michelle Milthorpe is the independent candidate backed by Climate 200 and Voices of FARA in the FARA by-election, aiming to replace Susan Ley. David Farley is the One Nation candidate in the FARA by-election, a 69-year-old local agribusiness consultant and former Nationals member. The FARA by-election is scheduled for May 9, 2026, following Susan Ley's resignation in February 2026 after losing the Liberal leadership. Liberal and Nationals how-to-vote cards will preference One Nation, David Farley, ahead of Michelle Milthorpe, potentially handing One Nation the seat. FARA is the second-largest electorate in NSW, covering 16% of the state, including Albury, Griffith, and agricultural towns like Deniliquin and Leeton. But not all outlets told the same story. The Guardian and ABC report that One Nation's support has slightly fallen in recent polls, while Newscomow does not mention this trend. Guardian and ABC describe Milthorpe as a frontrunner, but Newscomow frames her as trailing One Nation in internal polling. Guardian and ABC emphasize Milthorpe's regional focus and opposition to One Nation's policies, while Newscomow highlights her as a teal-backed candidate criticized by the right. This story was covered by ABC News, The Guardian, and news.com.au. Story 2 of 5. Assassination attempt at White House Correspondents Dinner targets Trump and officials. Assassination attempt at White House Correspondents Dinner targets Trump and officials. Here's what every outlet agrees on. Cole Thomas Allen, 31, from Torrance, California, is the suspect in the White House Correspondents' Dinner shooting on April 26, 2026. Allen was armed with a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun, a .38 caliber pistol, multiple knives, and daggers during the attack. The shooting occurred at the Washington Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C., during the White House Correspondents' Dinner on April 26, 2026, around 8:30 to 8:40 p.m. local time. Allen charged a Secret Service security checkpoint outside the ballroom where Donald Trump, Melania Trump, and other officials were seated. A Secret Service agent was shot but survived due to a bulletproof vest. No other attendees were seriously injured. But not all outlets told the same story. The Guardian and ABC report that Allen's family notified police in Connecticut about his writings 2 hours after the shooting, while the White House indicated police were told in the minutes before the shooting. The Guardian and ABC state that Allen was not shot during the incident, but some sources suggest he was injured and taken to the hospital for evaluation. The Guardian and ABC report that Allen was armed with a shotgun, handgun, and multiple knives, while some sources mention a rifle instead of a shotgun. This story was covered by ABC News, The Guardian, news.com.au, SBS News, Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Story 3 of 5. U.S. Supreme Court ruling weakens Voting Rights Act via Louisiana redistricting case. U.S. Supreme Court ruling weakens Voting Rights Act via Louisiana redistricting case. Here's what every outlet agrees on. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in Louisiana v. Calais on April 30, 2026, striking down a Louisiana congressional map with a second majority black district as an unconstitutional racial gerrymander. The ruling was split along ideological lines, with conservative justices forming the majority and liberal justices dissenting. The decision effectively limits the use of race in redistricting under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, making it harder to create majority-minority districts. Justice Samuel Alito wrote the majority opinion, arguing that compliance with the Voting Rights Act could not justify race-based redistricting. Justice Elena Kagan dissented, calling the ruling a demolition of the Voting Rights Act and warning it would allow states to systematically dilute minority voting power. But not all outlets told the same story. The Guardian describes the ruling as gutting a major section of the Voting Rights Act, while ABC frames it as sharply limiting the use of race without using the term gutting. The Guardian emphasizes the ruling as a terminal blow to the Voting Rights Act, while ABC states the core of the law remains intact but narrowed. The Guardian includes a quote from Donald Trump saying "I would" when asked if states should redraw maps, while ABC does not explicitly quote Trump on this point. This story was covered by ABC News and The Guardian. Story 4 of 5. Arrest of Jefferson Lewis over death of 5-year-old Kumanjayi little baby in Alice Springs. Arrest of Jefferson Lewis over death of 5-year-old Kumanjayi little baby in Alice Springs. Here's what every outlet agrees on. Kumanjayi little baby, a 5-year-old girl, went missing from old-timers Illaperoni Aboriginal Town Camp in Alice Springs on Saturday, April 25, 2026, at around 11:30 p.m. Her body was found by police on Thursday, April 30, 2026, at approximately 11:30 a.m., about 5 kilometers south of the camp near Todd River. Jefferson Lewis, 47, was arrested on Thursday, April 30, 2026, at around 10 p.m. at a residence in Alice Springs. Lewis was seen holding hands with Kumanjayi little baby on CCTV footage on Saturday night, April 25, 2026, before her disappearance. Lewis was released from prison only 6 days before Kumanjayi little baby's disappearance, with a history of serious assaults and domestic violence offenses. But not all outlets told the same story. The ABC and Newscomau report that Lewis was beaten by a vigilante group before police arrived, while SMH and The Age only mention that he was beaten prior to police apprehension without specifying who did it. The Guardian and ABC mention that Lewis was arrested at a residence in Alice Springs, but SMH and The Age also state he was found in Charles Creek before being taken to a residence for arrest. The ABC and Newscomau described the crowd outside the hospital as chanting for traditional payback, while SMH and The Age focus more on the violent clashes and police response. This story was covered by ABC News, The Guardian, news.com.au, SBS News, Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Story 5 of 5. Saudi Arabia ends LIV Golf funding, threatening tour's future. Saudi Arabia ends LIV Golf funding, threatening tour's future. Here's what every outlet agrees on. Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, PIF, will cease funding LIV Golf at the end of 2026, with no long-term commitment beyond this year. Yasir Al-Rumayyan, governor of PIF and a key LIV backer, is no longer involved in LIV's future leadership, with reports of his resignation from the board. LIV Golf has spent over $5 billion, £3.7 billion, since its launch in 2022, with estimates suggesting it will exceed $6 billion by year-end. LIV Golf announced a new independent board led by Gene Davis and John Zinman, replacing the PIF-dominated structure, to seek long-term investors. Bryson DeChambeau and John Rahm are among LIV's top players with multi-million-dollar contracts, and both have expressed uncertainty about their futures if funding collapses. But not all outlets told the same story. The Guardian states LIV Golf has spent over $5 billion since 2022, while ABC reports the figure is $5.3 billion and likely to exceed $6 billion by year-end. The Guardian mentions LIV postponed a Louisiana tournament in June, but ABC does not specify the exact month for the postponement, only that it was moved to autumn. ABC notes LIV had no title sponsors for its first 3 years, while The Guardian states LIV secured 5 title sponsors for 2026 without mentioning prior years. This story was covered by ABC News and The Guardian.